I never thought I'd see the day when so-called diverse and tolerant leftist state in New York would be just as racist as a state in the Jim Crow South, but here we are. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, ISIS, Imitation of Life. The Goddess Next Door helps a young black girl overcome racism during the era of Jim Crow in this Golden Age ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Imitation of Life in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. One of my viewers wanted to know my thoughts on Robert Brooks. Now, Robert Brooks was a 43-year-old black male inmate who was serving a 12-year sentence for an assault, and he was being transferred from the Mohawk Correctional Facility here in New York to the Marcy Correctional Facility. And as he was being transferred to this Marcy Correctional Facility, he was brutally beaten by white guards at this Marcy Correctional Facility. And as a result of this beating, which basically in some people's eyes looked like a lynching, Robert Brooks wound up dying as a result of the assault that was inflicted on him. And what's even more troubling than the beating that Robert Brooks received was the complete indifference of much of the staff at the Marcy Correctional Facility regarding the way Robert Brooks was treated, and the fact that no one showed any sort of regard for this man's life at all.
Back now to our top story tonight. The father and son of 43-year-old Robert Brooks joined by hundreds outside the Monroe County Jail to honor his life. 13 Wham Stephen Pappas brings us the latest from tonight's vigil as the calls for answers grow.
Yeah, Karen, it was a celebration of life outside the Monroe County Jail for Robert Brooks as loved ones and community members send a clear message demanding accountability and change. A Rochester family is reeling after the death of 43-year-old Robert Brooks.
His killing must be a catalyst for change. Justice must be served.
Brooks's son and father joined by hundreds for a vigil outside the Monroe County Jail to honor his life and bring light to the events leading up to his death. In body camera video released by the state attorney general, correctional officers can be seen beating a restrained Brooks at the Marcy Correctional Facility in Oneida County. His father devastated and outraged.
When you can stand around and watch a man get beat to death, wait your turn to hopefully administer the fatal blow, that's evil.
Brooks was halfway through serving a 12-year assault sentence that he received in Monroe County.
They denied my damn son a second chance. Yes. They denied him the second chance to be the best him he was capable of being.
Hundreds came together outside the Monroe County Jail calling for change.
This man was handcuffed and drugged in just like he was a piece of meat and thrown on a table and beaten to death. And then they hid it for weeks.
Those at Monday's rally showing support to people incarcerated in the Monroe County Jail by flashing lights at them. The prisoners responding by doing the same. As of today, the Attorney General's office says no charges have been filed. The Justice Department is also reviewing this case. Karen?
I had been meaning to do a video about Robert Brooks, but I wanted to make sure that I got all the information regarding this case, and I was doing extensive research on the entire tragedy that happened to Robert Brooks, and after getting all the information and watching the video, I was deeply disturbed at what I saw in that video. Because what I saw in the video of this prisoner transfer was a black man basically being brutalized by these guards who basically saw this inmate not as a person or an American citizen that had rights. No, they saw basically Robert Brooks as someone less than human, and that's the reason why they basically brought Robert Brooks in. I mean, if you look at the video, they are carrying Robert Brooks like a cow or a sheep, and they don't really see him as a person. And they carry him into the infirmary where he's already bleeding. And as they carry him into the infirmary, we have this mob of guards surrounding him. And they basically show how little they care about the rights of black men. I mean, when I look at this case of Robert Brooks, it really is disturbing when we consider that we just had George Floyd 5 years ago wind up losing his life at the hands of a law enforcement officer who basically thought he was above the law to the point where he could murder someone in the middle of the street during a pandemic. And that in and of itself was disturbing to me, that here we have, during a pandemic, a officer basically believing that he can still go out here and participate in anti-black racism, even during a pandemic that's basically taking the lives of humanity all around us. This person still believes in the whole concept of white supremacy and looks to go out here and participate in his racist and white supremacist behavior, even during a pandemic that's taking the lives of people all over the world. And what's even more sad is that even after the death of George Floyd, where we saw a black man murdered in front of us and black people literally rioting in the streets 5 years ago, we still have black men winding up being murdered by people who are in either law enforcement or, in this case, a correctional facility. And instead of looking out for the safety of an inmate as related to his human rights, what we have are a group of white guards who go out here and participate in what I believe to be a lynching filmed on screen. And this is even in the aftermath of laws such as body cams, which are supposed to so-called stop a lot of this brutality, and I would just believe cruel and inhumane behavior. The body cams were supposed to stop this type of inhumane behavior, and we see that the body cams do absolutely nothing at all, and they do nothing at all because the people who are wearing the body cams basically believe in the concept of white supremacy and believe in the concept of white supremacy more than they believe in the concept of rule of law that is written in our U.S. Constitution. And when it comes to these individuals, again, believe that because they are white, they believe that they are above the law, because the only concept they basically believed in is the concept of white supremacy. And what's even more troubling than anything about these white male guards is that all of these white male guards are not in a southern red state, in places where the Jim Crow South was. No, what we have are a bunch of people who are from a blue state that's supposed to be liberal and tolerant, a blue state where everybody's supposed to be all about diversity and inclusion. But in this blue state, we're supposed to be about diversity and inclusion, we have the third incident of anti-black racism to go on in this state. I mean, we are just a couple of weeks after the verdict that acquitted Daniel Penny for murdering Jordan Neely, and just a few weeks after Daniel Penny was acquitted for the murder of Jordan Neely, we have Robert Brooks being brutalized by all of these mostly predominantly white male guards, and even worse was the complete indifference to Robert Brooks's life by the staff at this Marcy Correctional Facility. That's what's even more disturbing to me, is how completely indifferent everyone was to that black man's life. And again, this is 5 years after the murder of George Floyd, who himself was in another blue tolerant leftist liberal state. He came from a tolerant liberal state, and here we have New York, which is considered to be one of the most tolerant and so-called more liberal states. And we have another racial incident where a black man basically is treated like less of a human being by these correctional officers, and the brutalization of this black man went through is worse than anything I've seen from footage in the Iraq War as related to the humiliation that inmates at Abu Ghraib, that prison, suffered. That's what's really troubling and disturbing to me. And troubling and disturbing to me because many of these people who were a part of the Blue Party always talked about diversity and inclusion, talked about racial tolerance, talked about acceptance of black people. But when we look at the state of New York, the state of New York is looking a lot like a state that was a part of the Democrat Jim Crow South. Looks just like one of those states like Alabama, Mississippi, that Dr. King and many people marched as related to the civil rights movement. That's what New York is looking like, and this is basically why I call New York the part of the Jim Crow North, because when I look at the state of New York, the state of New York is the same type of democratic state, just like those corrupt Jim Crow southern states. And basically what we have here is people participating in the same type of anti-black racism that they participated in the Jim Crow South. And basically these people believe that they are above the laws of the U.S. Constitution and are heavily invested in white supremacy. And what's even more disturbing than, again, the death of Robert Brooks is, again, the complete indifference to black human life as related to the case of Robert Brooks, not only by those staff at the Marcy Correctional Facility, but the complete indifference to Robert Brooks's life, because Robert Brooks wound up being, I believe, murdered on December 9th, but we didn't find out about his death until December 15th, and most people did in the Attorney General's office, even though they knew about his death, didn't really want to do anything about the death of Robert Brooks because they just didn't see a black man's life as having any value whatsoever. I mean, I thought according to our U.S. Constitution and according to things like the Geneva Codes, again, we were supposed to have laws to, again, assure that inmates would be treated in a humane fashion. But when we look at that video of Robert Brooks, this man is treated in a less humane fashion than the Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib. I mean, the Abu Ghraib prisoners were treated with more humanity than Robert Brooks was. I mean, this man was basically carted into the jail as related to a transfer to the infirmary with injuries, and instead of getting care for his injuries, what happened with Robert Brooks was these guards further escalated their behavior to further inflict more pain on this man. I mean, as I watched that video, I was deeply disturbed by everything that I watched in that video. I mean, this video was just hard to watch because they beat this man mercilessly and beat him as he was injured. Then after they beat him when he was handcuffed and he couldn't fight back, I mean, this mob of individuals then further went on to, after they beat him up, they humiliated him by leaving him in his underwear. I mean, the way they treated this man was nothing short of a lynching. Basically, a mob of white guards looking to just, again, go out here and humiliate a man and destroy a man's life, take away his dignity, take away his humanity, and just, again, after viciously beating him, leave him to die. And what's even worse is as this man is being beaten in this infirmary by these so-called correctional officers, the staff is sitting there completely indifferent. And as the cams are showing, there's a guy in the hallway smiling. I mean, just no regard for human life, no regard for human life at all as related to this entire incident. I mean, they treated this man, again, worse than, again, I'll keep repeating it because I want you to think about Abu Ghraib, where our soldiers basically, again, took, who were renegade, went out here and took the humiliated people and took their lives in Iraq. But here in America, in leftist liberal New York, this is done to a black man, and there's basically a media blackout until about 6 or 7 days later, where we get a story spun where our New York governor, Kathy Hochul, goes out here and says she's horrified by this whole incident, and horrified to the point where she is calling for these individuals to be fired, but doesn't call for her attorney general, Letitia James, to go out here and file charges against these individuals. And that's where I have a beef with Letitia James, the so-called black female attorney general. I mean, this mammy and this bootlick basically sit there and do absolutely nothing to get charges on these people as related to this case of, again, inhumanity. This case of inhumanity, she does nothing to get charges put on these individuals. And Kathy Hochul, in and of herself, being the governor of New York, who runs the corrections department, does nothing to to terminate these individuals immediately. No, what they both do is basically give an empty statement, showing me again how this blue state of New York is running and operating just like a state in the Jim Crow South, such as Alabama or Mississippi, and there's no different from that southern group of Democrats that came from Jim Crow, such as Bull Connor and Kathy Hochul, and even worse, this Letitia James, who basically has turned herself into the black female version of Stephen from the movie Django Unchained, and sat there and again did nothing as related to getting some justice for this man, Robert Brooks, because they basically see Robert Brooks as, again, nobody, because he's just a black man, and again, a black man they don't need to regard because he was just an inmate, not understanding that this man has rights as an American citizen under the U.S. Constitution, and the way he's being treated is worse than we would treat an inmate in Abu Ghraib or any other individual. And again, it's really sad that you've got people who would, again, treat many of these prisoners in Abu Ghraib or the people who were caught and were in Guantanamo Bay better than a black man. That's what's really troubling to me about this whole case that's happening, again, in a so-called tolerant leftist blue state, a so-called tolerant and leftist blue state that basically is participating in Jim Crow enforcement of law. Again, the Jim Crow North is basically in full effect in states like Minnesota, New York, and many other blue states. And it's basically, again, mirroring the Democratic state that was in the Jim Crow South, with all of the corruption that went on in those places, like where Bull Connor was. I mean, to me, Kathy Hochul and Letitia James are just the female versions of Bull Connor, and they basically, again, are not interested in getting justice, but just keeping the white system of white supremacy going on here in the blue state of New York. Now, the viewer wants to know if the police officers who murdered Robert Brooks deserve life in prison or the death penalty. Well, I believe that these rogue, they're not police officers, they're correction guards, and these correction guards definitely, I would say, deserve life in prison in the Supermax. But it's looking like the system of white supremacy is trying to go out here and give them cover, because they have the complexion for protection. And they want to give them that cover because in the system of white supremacy, they want to, again, continue allowing these white racists to have the privilege of going out here and being able to take the lives of black people, because in the system of white supremacy, they want to keep black men at the bottom of the world, and they believe that they have the right to take a black man's life with impunity, because to them, black people don't have any sort of humanity And what's even sadder about this whole case is that as they don't see black people as having humanity, you have a black woman leading the charge because she won't go out here and look to enforce the law as related to the protecting the rights of a Robert Brooks, a prisoner who should get the same rights under the Constitution, because our Constitution states that everyone is supposed to have those basic human rights. Moreover, according to things like the Geneva Convention, inmates all across the globe are supposed to have the basic human rights. But when it comes to a black man, we see that the only policy that's being enforced in this case is white supremacy. The only policy being enforced is the policy of white supremacy, and they believe that because these are white men, they are above the law because they're white, they say so, and in the system of white supremacy, the white man basically can get away with all sorts of crimes because he, again, has that complexion for the protection. Now, the viewer further wants me to talk about, how we can improve the criminal justice and legal system. And when it comes down to this criminal justice and legal system, you have to understand that this criminal justice system was never meant to be about justice. No, it was just about maintaining the system of white supremacy and having these laws on the books to be able to maintain that system of white supremacy and give many people who are white technicalities to be able to circumvent these laws and get passes to participate in this criminal behavior. This is what the system of white supremacy wants to provide, and this is why you have Kathy Hochul being distant and silent about this whole case, and again having no regard for this black man's life because she doesn't see black people as human beings. And that was shown by the statement where she said that black kids in the Bronx don't know how to use computers, even though we had computers for years, because she doesn't see black people as people. And even worse, you got Letitia James, the black mammy bootlick, again thinking about her career and not thinking about rights, because she thinks that she won't be the one who has to suffer under the system of white supremacy. And what's really troubling here is that this woman went after Donald Trump with more tenacity than she did after the people who did this to Robert Brooks. I mean, she went after Donald Trump with the full force of the law, but we see this woman is basically timid as a church mouse when it comes to the white men who persecuted Robert Brooks. Timid as a church mouse as related to Robert Brooks, and she'll sit there and say, oh, I'm trying to find out what's going on as related to the law. But we see the only law that she's following are the unwritten rules of white supremacy as related to this case, and that's why we really can't rely as related to thinking about improving this criminal justice and legal system by going out here and electing just any black person. Now, the viewer wants to know, how can we improve the criminal justice and legal system? Now, this legal system in and of itself will not change unless we topple the system of white supremacy, because the only way to change this legal system is to topple the system of white supremacy, because the only way to change this system is to change it from a system of white supremacy, which is all about giving unethical white racist opportunities as related to goodies, giveaways, and freebies like Professor Black Truth talks about, and allow them to take black lives with impunity. We have to replace this with a system of actual justice, and only through a system of actual justice can we get justice for black people. And again, the only way to get to that, basically, black people have to start standing up for themselves and stand up and demand justice. Again, demand justice the way people demanded justice in the case of George Floyd. That's the only way you can get towards the road to justice, because as long as that system of white supremacy remains in place, and you cannot, again, get justice, and again, you can't work in that system because that system is rigged and designed to basically make it where you're never going to get justice. No, just like people thought they were going to get justice with Daniel Penny, people thought they were going to be able to get justice by going out here and just doing a little bit of protesting, but that's just not enough. No, you have to continue to keep the hammer down like people did with the case of George Floyd. But the problem with a lot of black people is we don't stay vigilant. We don't stay vigilant like in the case of Ahmaud Arbery's family, where they tried to run game on Ahmaud Arbery's family, but the family insisted on justice. And because they insisted on justice, what happened was all of the killers of Ahmaud Arbery are currently in prison, and white supremacy couldn't run its games as related to Ahmaud Arbery, and we have to maintain that same sense of vigilance, whether it be an inmate who is, again, like Robert Brooks, or a black man like George Floyd. We have to maintain vigilance. We have to maintain vigilance to get towards justice. And again, justice is something that we have to keep fighting for. We have to keep fighting for it. You just can't, again, think you can work within the system. You have to work outside of the system to make sure that it works. Insist that it works a certain way. I mean, the big mistake a lot of black people make is thinking you're going to be able to, again, get justice by just trusting the system. But that system of white supremacy is one that has to be toppled if you want to get to the road to justice, because the road to justice is one where you have to keep fighting and, again, keep vigilant about things. That's a mistake a lot of black people make. And what happened with Robert Brooks, again, it was one of the most disturbing cases that I've seen in my life. I mean, I sat through some racial incidents here in New York that showed it's not as tolerant or liberal, even though it's supposed to be the most tolerant and democratic state. I've lived through incidents like Michael Griffith and Michael Stewart in Howard Beach, and cases like Eleanor Bumpers as a little boy, and Bernhard Goetz. I've lived through things like the Korean black boycott of 1990 during David Dinkins, the Crown Heights riots, and basically seen the same type of anti-black racism go on here in New York that it did in the Jim Crow South. But what's happened under Kathy Hochul, the so-called first white female governor, is I've seen this racism get progressively worse in this so-called progressive state. And I've seen this state basically become just as bad as a state in the Jim Crow South, and just as corrupt as a state in the Jim Crow South, and shows me that the Democrats of 2024 are no different than the Democrats of 1944 that ran all the states in the Jim Crow South. And in order for us to be able to get this state again right, we would have to, again, deal with the white supremacy that's going on. White supremacy, nobody wants to talk about that, goes on here in New York. A lot of people don't want to talk about the white supremacy that goes on here that basically has turned this state into a disaster, because what happened to Robert Brooks should have never happened. I mean, if this happened to an Iraqi prisoner or one of these terrorists, it would be called an international incident, and America would be optically embarrassed because it would basically be seen as an exposure of its hypocrisy in its democracy. But sadly, that hypocrisy as related to its democracy is not seen as related to what happened here in this state. I mean, this happened to a black man, an American citizen who had constitutional rights. Even though he was an inmate, he still had rights. And these white male guards basically treated him like he was just like nobody. I mean, basically, like Ku Klux Klansmen just decided to lynch this black man, and take his life. That's what happened here as related to Robert Brooks. And again, the only way we can combat this is to, again, go out here and look to overthrow this system of white supremacy that operates behind the scenes, debunk this sick, twisted religion that has been a part of America's culture, and again, look to change our system of white supremacy, this depraved system, into a system of justice where everyone has rights under the law, even if they are an inmate, have rights under the law, because what was done to Robert Brooks was a crime against humanity. It was a crime against humanity what was done to Robert Brooks. And the way we, again, have to go out here, again, people have to get out in the streets, because if an inmate can't have rights and a homeless man can't have rights, again, these type of fascists, basically, they start with black people and people they think that they don't need to regard, and they escalate their behavior to oppressing citizens. So we, the people, really need to take a critical look at how black men are being treated, because the people who would be inhumane to black people would go out here and promote being inhumane to others. I mean, if we look at this Hochul administration, again, if a black man who's an inmate can't have rights, and again, these people who say that they're so leftist and so tolerant, again, participate in tolerance against black people, I mean, it shows how hypocritical they are, but just shows how, again, how these people, again, are not about, again, maintaining any standard of law for we, the people. And this whole situation is one that I just found to be quite disturbing, because it shows, along with this hypocrisy in our democracy, we black people, again, we have to be vigilant and stand out and push against this. And again, as we push against this, this is why we have to pick our own candidates, because we can't rely on bootlicks like Letitia James, who are hand-picked shills. No, we have to be, like the late David Carroll said, be a part of the political process with our agenda. And part of our agenda is getting justice for foundational black Americans, getting justice for foundational black Americans, and ensuring that people like this get punished. People who participate in these crimes, like what's done at this prison, are punished. I mean, what's really troubling here is that what's happening here with these guards, with Kathy Hochul and Letitia James, Slow Dragon, is they're participating in the same behavior that the Red President George W. Bush participated in with Abu Ghraib, where those white guards, those white soldiers got away with just about dehumanizing those Iraqis, but even they basically saw those Iraqis as a human being, but didn't see Robert Brooks as a human being. That's what's really twisted here, because the system of white supremacy sees black people at the bottom. And what's really sad here is that we don't see how a man basically was treated with less dignity than a prisoner in Abu Ghraib during a war. And this, basically, in this state, again, this whole case should be investigated with a federal crime, as a federal crime, because Robert Brooks' civil rights were violated. Robert Brooks' human rights were violated. Robert Brooks was treated as less as a human being. And what was done to Robert Brooks was worse than what was done to prisoners of war. I mean, this man was treated worse than a prisoner of war. And this is happening, again, in a blue state that's so tolerant and accepting, in a country where we're supposed to have so-called freedom as related to a country, but we see that a black man basically is in the same place that he was in Jim Crow America almost 100 years ago. I mean, I have to wonder if we are in 1925 or 2025. Now, this was a video requested by a viewer, and if you want to request a video, you can drop a donation to the PayPal or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my books on the SJS Direct imprint, you can find those books on Amazon.com. in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS Legacy. Sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, A Thorn in My Side. The man who rules the world takes on an agent from the CIA from the Black Boule in this action-packed all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side at Amazon.com and other online booksellers. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.